For 35 years she had been his whole world, and now Samuel Hayes refused to leave the only place where he could still feel her presence. The cold ground beneath the oak tree where he had buried his heart along with his wife. Please subscribe the channel, press bell, like, comments, and share this video. Thanks for watching. The sun was setting over the Montana hills when Samuel Hayes finished digging the hole beneath the old oak tree. His hands were blistered and bleeding, but he didn't notice. He couldn't feel anything except the hollow emptiness that had carved itself into his chest 3 days ago when Clara had closed her eyes for the last time. He stood there, shovel in hand, staring at the simple wooden coffin that held everything he had ever loved in this world. The pastor from town had offered to help, but Samuel had refused. This was something he needed to do himself. Clara deserved that much. "I remember the first time I saw you," he whispered to the evening air, his voice cracking like dry leather. "You were standing outside your daddy's general store, laughing at something your sister said. Your hair was catching the sunlight, and I thought I'd never seen anything so beautiful in all my years." Samuel Hayes had been 23 years old that summer, a drifter with nothing to his name but a tired horse and a worn saddle. He'd ridden into the small town of Cedar Falls looking for work, never expecting to find his reason for living. Clara Miller had been 19, with eyes the color of spring grass and a smile that could warm the coldest winter night. She'd looked at him that first day like she could see straight through to his soul, and Samuel had known right then that his wandering days were over. Her father hadn't approved. Thomas Miller was a respectable businessman, and he had plans for his daughter that didn't include a penniless cowboy with dust on his boots and nothing in his pockets. He'd forbidden Clara from speaking to Samuel, threatened to send her to live with relatives back east, but Clara had her mother's stubborn spirit. She'd sneak out at night to meet Samuel by the creek that ran behind the old mill. They'd sit on the mossy bank, listening to the water sing over the rocks, talking about everything and nothing. Samuel told her about the places he'd seen, the mountains that touched the sky, the rivers that ran so clear you could count the stones on the bottom. Clara told him about her dreams, about wanting to see the world beyond the little town where she'd been born. "Take me with you," she'd said one night, her hand finding his in the darkness. "When you leave, take me with you." Samuel had looked at her then, at the moonlight dancing in her eyes, at the hope written across her face, and he'd made a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "I ain't going anywhere without you, Clara Miller. Not ever again." They'd been married 3 months later, in a small ceremony by the creek where they'd fallen in love. Clara's father hadn't come, but her mother had, crying happy tears and pressing a silver locket into Clara's palm. "This was my grandmother's," she'd whispered. "She crossed an ocean for love. You've got her courage in your blood." Now Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out that same locket. It was warm from resting against his heart, where he'd kept it since Clara had pressed it into his hand during her final moments. "Don't you forget me, Samuel Hayes," she'd said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't you let yourself become a ghost." He lowered the coffin into the ground as the last light faded from the sky. The stars came out one by one, the same stars he and Clara had counted on their wedding night, lying in the back of the wagon that had carried them to their new life. They'd built their homestead with their own hands. Samuel had felled the trees and shaped the logs while Clara had mixed the mud for the chinking between them. They'd argued about the placement of the windows and laughed when the first rain revealed the leaks in the roof they'd thought was finished. Those early years had been hard. The land was unforgiving, and there were times when they'd had nothing to eat but wild berries and hope. But they'd had each other, and somehow that had been enough. Samuel remembered the winter of their 3rd year, when the snow had piled so high it nearly reached the eaves. They'd been trapped inside for weeks, rationing their meager supplies, burning furniture when the firewood ran out. One night, when the cold seemed like it would swallow them whole, Clara had started to sing. Her voice wasn't particularly beautiful. She'd always joked that the angels had given her everything except the ability to carry a tune. But to Samuel, lying there in the darkness with his arms around her. It was the most precious sound in the world. She'd sung about green hills and summer meadows, about lovers reunited and journeys that led home. And when the spring finally came and the snow melted into rushing streams, Samuel had built her a piano. It took him 3 months, working in secret in the barn, using plans he'd gotten from a traveling salesman. It wasn't perfect, several keys stuck and the tone was slightly off, but Clara had cried when she saw it. "You foolish, wonderful man," she'd said, throwing her arms around his neck. "I can't even play. Then we'll learn together," Samuel had replied. Neither of them ever mastered the instrument, but they spent countless evenings sitting, side by side on the bench, picking out simple melodies and laughing at their mistakes. The sound of that piano, however imperfect, had filled their home with joy. Now the piano sat silent in the corner of their cabin, gathering dust. Samuel finished filling in the grave as the moon rose over the hills. He'd carved the headstone himself, working through the night with tears blurring his vision. Clara Hayes, beloved wife, 1856 to 1891. My heart, my home, my everything. He sank to his knees beside the fresh earth, and for the first time since she'd passed, he let himself weep. The sobs came from somewhere deep inside him, a place he hadn't known existed, and they tore through him like a summer storm. They'd never had children. Clara had wanted them desperately, had prayed for them every Sunday in the little church they'd built with their neighbors. But the babies had never come, and eventually they'd made peace with it. They had each other, and their love was enough to fill any empty spaces. "I don't know how to do this without you," Samuel said to the grave. "I don't know who I am when you're not here to tell me." The wind rustled through the oak leaves, and for a moment, Samuel could almost hear her voice in the sound. He stayed there that night, and the next night, and the night after that. The neighbors came by with food and condolences, but Samuel barely noticed them. He ate when they forced him to, drank water when his body demanded it, but his mind was somewhere else, lost in 35 years of memories. He remembered the way Clara had looked on their 10th anniversary, when he surprised her with a bolt of blue fabric she'd been admiring in town. She'd made a dress from it and worn it to the harvest dance, and Samuel had been the proudest man in the county as he'd twirled her across the wooden floor. He remembered the fever that had nearly taken her when she was 30, how he'd sat by her bedside for 2 weeks straight, bargaining with God, promising anything if only she would open her eyes again. When she'd finally woken, weak but alive, Samuel had fallen to his knees in gratitude. He remembered the quiet evenings on their porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson, her hand resting in his, no words needed between them. And he remembered her last days when the illness that had been stealing her strength finally claimed its victory. She'd faced it with the same courage she'd shown when she'd defied her father, when she'd learned to survive on a harsh frontier, when she'd built a life out of nothing but love and determination. "I'm not afraid," she'd told him, her hand thin and fragile in his rough grasp. "I've had more happiness in this life than most people dare to dream of. That was because of you, Samuel. Don't leave me," he'd begged, not caring that his voice broke, that tears streamed down his weathered face. "I can't do this without you." Clara had smiled then, that same smile that had captured his heart 40 years ago in front of a general store. "You're the strongest man I've ever known," she'd said. "You'll find your way. And when your time comes, I'll be waiting." A week passed, then 2. The autumn turned cold, and still, Samuel kept his vigil by the grave. He talked to Clara every day, telling her about the things she was missing, the changing colors of the leaves, the geese flying south, the way the morning frost made the grass sparkle like diamonds. One afternoon, he heard hoofbeats approaching and looked up to see a young woman on horseback. She had Clara's color of eyes, and Clara's stubborn set to her jaw. It was Mary, their neighbor's daughter, who had loved Clara like a grandmother. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, dismounting and walking toward him, You can't keep living out here. Clara wouldn't want this for you. Clara wanted me to remember, Samuel replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. She wanted me to keep living, but she didn't understand that she was my life, Mary. Without her, I'm just marking time until I can see her again. Mary sat down beside him, her young face serious and kind. She told me something a few days before she passed, Mary said. She made me promise to share it with you when the time was right. I think maybe that time is now. Samuel looked at her, something flickering behind his grief-dulled eyes. She said that loving you was the greatest adventure of her life. She said you took a scared girl who'd never been more than 10 miles from home and showed her a whole world she never knew existed. Not by traveling, but by teaching her that home wasn't a place, it was a feeling. And that feeling was you. Mary paused, wiping a tear from her cheek. She said that when she was gone, she wanted you to remember that. She wanted you to know that you carry that home inside you, Samuel. Wherever you go, whatever you do, she's there. Not just in this grave, but in your heart. She said she trusted you to find a way to keep living, because that's what love does. It doesn't end with death. It carries on, in the people who remember, in the stories that get told, in the lives that get lived in honor of what was shared. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the headstone, at the words he'd carved with his own hands. Then, slowly, he nodded. She always was smarter than me, he said, and for the first time in weeks, something like a smile crossed his weathered face. He didn't leave the grave that day, or the next. But something had changed. He began to eat properly, to tend to the homestead, to care for the animals that depended on him. Every evening he still came to sit beneath the oak tree. But now he brought his whittling knife and a block of wood. He was making something, though he didn't yet know what. As winter settled over the hills, Samuel Hayes began to live again. Not the way he had before, not the same man he'd been when Clara was beside him, but a different kind of living, one built on memory and gratitude and the enduring power of a love that had changed him forever. And every sunset, without fail, he took his place by the grave and told Clara about his day, knowing that somewhere, somehow, she was listening,